All right, hello everyone. So it is January 5th. We are back in the rhythm of the nature of order. The sun has broken through after some intense rain. It's been very pleasant. The sun, that is. The rain was probably good to have. So, previously on the nature of order, talked about wholeness and the theory of centers, about what the centers are, how they work. You can look at the last episode for that. Now we're talking about how life comes from wholeness. This is the start of this chapter, chapter 4, starting on page 110 for those of you following along at home. And this chapter talks about some of the practical, it's a further examination of how you actually get a vibrant environment by I shouldn't say assembly, by the shaping of space with these properties surfacing and being aware of them. So at the start of it, defining these things, it's saying we do not yet have a clear idea of degrees of wholeness or degrees of life, how one thing comes to have more life than another. The key idea in this book is that life is structural. It has a quality which comes about because of the existence of a discernible structure in the wholeness. Therefore explains what we perceive as the quality of buildings and artifacts. The structure is something I shall later define as living structure. And this chapter shows in detail how life occurs because of the wholeness. And their basic 4 key ideas, he says, all arising from the structure of wholeness described in the previous chapter. 1. Centers themselves have life. 2. Centers help one another. The existence of life in one center can intensify the life of another. Centers are made of centers, the recursive nature. This is the only way of describing their composition. 4, and again, that is, as we said last time, like the monads, like the Leibnizian situation. 4, a structure gets its life according to the density and intensity of centers which have been formed in it. And he's saying these 4 points, simple as they are, give us the secret of living structure and of the way that life comes from the wholeness. He talks about the Hotel Palumbo, which is a very, very charming area. It's right near where I lived in Italy. I never had the chance to exactly go there, although I could. It's on the Gulf of Salerno, and he's saying, a few summers ago, my family and I went to Ravello, a few miles south of Naples, high above the Mediterranean, looking down over the Bay of Salerno. We stayed in a small hotel, first built as a palace in the 11th century. One of my favorite places in the hotel was the garden and terrace overlooking the Gulf. And this is very poetic, but this is the way it feels there. The bay is a soft blue, and there is a perpetual haze, so that the blue of the sea and the blue of the sky are not divided, and one looks out into a pale blue sphere of light. The hotel garden is quite small, filled with flowers, and has a lovely terrace right at the edge of the cliff. If we asked for it, our breakfast was brought out to this garden, which we had quite to ourselves. I imagine that can happen if you stay there in the off-season especially. Every morning we sat there for hours having our coffee, watching the Gulf, while the children played among the flowers of the garden and tried to catch the lizards. And then he lists various things which you can describe as centers, a big long list, starting off from the larger ones to the smaller ones, the bays formed by 4 columns, the capital of the column, the 9 parts of the trellis, all the way down through this big list to things like vines growing on the columns and small things, the blue shimmering of the sea, the filtered sunlight dappling the grass. So, and this is that's another theme that's also in pattern language, that when you're identifying these things, it's very useful to go from a large scale to a small scale. Frank Lloyd Wright also echoed this, talking about going from generals to particulars. Also Sullivan, I think that's very that kind of order of operations is very important and useful in design. So a good example of how this works, he started thinking when he was there, okay, what about this place feels so special and wonderful? Are there things you can learn about this space that creates that? So here's a quick drawing. He even measured stuff. Isn't that great? That's a freehand sketch, but with measured dimensions for that column. And there's square columns, but with chamfered corners. And so he looked at that vernacular, traditional touch and thought, wait a minute, what's going on with that? And when you contrast You have square columns on one side and chamfered columns on the other. And even looking on that in plan, you can see how he makes the difference between helping and not helping. This is like those old optometrist trick things before in the previous episodes where one side has more life, one side has less life. So you can see that is an example of what he will later call a structure-preserving transformation, something where you change the geometry of it to increase the intensity of life. And that's one example, and one subtle way to show how and why these columns and the courtyard work as well as they do. That's another view of those columns in the situation. This also occurs in the biological environment as well as the built environment. This photo, I think this photo is very interesting with his diagram that he puts next to it, the photo of the leaves. And then you can see the isolated elements where he has the photo of everything there. And then you can draw your attention wherever you're placing, you can place your attention, you can zoom your attention out or zoom your attention in. And our good human pattern recognizing brains will find different scales of centers to focus on. There is the wholeness of the leaf that he shows, the wholeness of where the stem attaches, the wholeness of the edges of the leaf, the wholeness of the segment of the leaf. And all of these things are centers that are, like he just said, it's a great example, right? That we have these recursive centers, that each center is made up of other centers, and there you have an example of the tree itself is made of the leaf itself is made up of those center parts. And they themselves are made up of further things. And you can just keep on going with that down to the level of cells and so forth. But it's not mechanistically assembled. And in the case of biology, it's something that literally grows and develops and turns, in the case of a sunflower, that turns with the sun and so forth. He doesn't mention... I kind of wish that he would have mentioned Goethe more often. Goethe was in that very similar part of the world. He was over on the other side of those small mountains, round about near where I was living. He stayed in Naples and I think visited. There was this rather badly behaved princess who wanted to have Goethe visit her palazzo in Sorrento, and he never ended up doing it because she was such an ill-tempered woman. But there's a funny scene from Goethe's Reise nach Italien where he describes this. But you can see how Goethe wrote about how plants grow and the whole idea of morphology. This whole book and this whole discipline, if you wanted to call it morphology, the discipline of the creation of shape and the growth of shape and form, yes, that's what it is. He uses that word a lot, but he never ties it back to Goethe, which I guess he doesn't have to, but I think it could be useful and interesting. Now, I was mentioning Alan Watts and some of the other things. He does mention and cite Alan Watts quite directly. So here he talks about, again, centers are always made of other centers. A center is not a point. It's not a perceived center of gravity. It's a field of organized force. That's Aristotelian. That's what you call an entelechy. Leibniz also referred to this force as organized form, called an entelechy. That's a way of understanding things. Force as embodied form. Very important heuristiker way of seeing things. This whole book is very Aristotelian. And Platonic, but we won't get into that right now. It is rather a field of organized force in an object or part of an object, which makes that object or part exhibit centrality. This field-like centrality is fundamental to the idea of wholeness. And then he gives endnote 6. When you follow endnote 6, what do you find? You find Alan Watts, page 141. It is an interesting passage. In an interesting passage, Alan Watts seems to anticipate the idea of a field-like center. Theoretically, this is quoting Alan Watts. I won't do the Alan Watts voice, maybe a little bit. Theoretically, many scientists know that the individual is not a skin-encapsulated ego, but an organism-environment field. The organism itself is the point at which the field is focused, so that each individual is a unique expression of the behavior of the whole field, which is ultimately the universe itself. But to know this theoretically is not to feel it to be so. There's another bit in Alan Watts, that whole skin-encapsulated ego not being a good way of describing things. That's something Alan Watts brings up quite a bit. An image, you could call it a myth if you want, a mythic image in the Joseph Campbellian sense, that each individual, each of us as individuals, are something that the whole universe is doing, in the sense that a wave, any given wave, is something that the whole ocean is doing. And that's a good analogy, because it's something that we can grasp rather easily, that you can see how all the waves of the ocean are, no matter how far apart they are, they're all interacting each other. And the waves that are closer interact with each other more strongly. And there's a technical term for this. It's called monadic occlusion. It's something that Leibniz gets into, that even though all the monads in all the universe interact with each other, there is what he calls perception and appetition, the input and the output of the centers, that this perception and appetition kind of fades out infinitesimally. Keep in mind, this is the guy who invented one of the great ways of doing calculus, infinitesimal gradation. He understood very well. So everything in the universe, think of the butterfly effect, everything in the universe is affecting everything else, but to different degrees. My voice, the reason you can hear me, my voice is affecting the microphone very strongly. Someone outside, much, much, much less strongly. Maybe they could barely hear me. I hope they can barely hear me, that I'm not bothering them. But so this is a way that you can understand how all of these centers mutually interact with each other, that they're not discrete points. They're not the Newtonian billiard balls discretely bouncing around. And this frame of mind, that billiard ball thinking, is still very, very good if you're doing the discrete type of physics, if you're doing ballistics, if you're doing rocketry. Also, perhaps even if you're building a bridge. But these, the basic engineering of it. But the sense of this wholeness in the environment field, which I would say the best bridge engineers are also aware of on a certain intuitive level, and that does come into design, and this distinction that says to know this theoretically, that Alan Watts says, to know this theoretically about the interconnection is not to feel it to be so. And what Chris is trying to emphasize, I believe, is that you need to, in order to make the good design decisions, you need to be aware of this feeling. And he talks about that later. He calls it the mirror of the self test, which we'll get into later, as a way of having a kind of inner compass to navigate what is called configuration space, the world of possible designs. And then you have the path of decisions, which eventually at the end of that path of decisions is your finished object. So the diagram of each structure, each center as a field. And so you can see this. This is really fascinating. So this is on it's either Turkish or Persian. Anatolian, it's Turkish. So you have a Turkish carpet, Turkish rug, a Turkish rug, and that pattern. And what he has above it is a diagram showing kind of the dynamics of what he calls the geometric forces at play. You have kind of an inward movement, you have an outward movement, you have a sense of centrality in the middle of that kind of cloverleaf shape, and things pressing up against it or out, and a central axis of symmetry. And so you can start to understand that there is a very dynamic, a fascinatingly dynamic aspect to this, where each geometric quality exerts an influence on the geometries nearer to it. And so when you harmonize and tune these to each other, then this sense of vibrancy, this sense of life, comes up and out of the of the feeling. And here he has the same carpet in color. Add the color, see the whole thing. He simplified it to the black and white for the purposes of that example. And then he does a similar thing with understanding the elements on that next page. And going along about how each center has its life, 5 assertions, he says. Each that centers arise in space. Each center is created by a configuration of other centers. Each center has a certain life or intensity. For the time being, we do not know what this life is, but we can see that life or any one center depends on the other centers. The life or intensity of one center is increased or decreased according to the position and intensity of other nearby centers. This is a mutually reinforcing thing. The centers are fundamental elements of the wholeness and the degree of life, and any given part of the space depends entirely on the presence and structure of the centers there. Now, yesterday's thing, which was just kind of some random musings about sense of, not exactly random, but rambling, I should say, as if I do anything but. The sense of play is very important because you're seeing that described in a certain way here, that there is a playfulness. There's a playfulness to the discovery of this, to the design process generally. I mean, who does design because they hate it, honestly? You do design because you love doing it and because you make great things, and it is fun and wonderful. So there's a sense of play that's discovered in it, and the sense of creating this vibrancy has a playful element, and that's important. It's not adversarial. It's not that they're struggling against each other to push against something. This whole idea of that the avant-garde was obsessed with because they wanted to be nihilistic. An avant-garde sense always wants to tear down or confront something, and this is not avant-garde. That's one of the reasons why, perhaps one of the reasons why Chris's ideas were a bit uncomfortable. There are many reasons why the ideas might be a bit uncomfortable. He talks about spiritual things, and that made some people uncomfortable, but also the idea that it's not pushing against anything so much, that that it is playful, that it's not about struggle. And then people who are so invested in the idea of struggle might say, oh, no, wait a minute, where's the struggle? I suffered through all this struggle. Everyone should, that's not... I think it's good to move beyond all that type of stuff. Along those lines, here he goes over this wonderful sense of iteration. He's kind of reverse engineering. We don't have time to go over this in depth. By the way, we're about a third of the way through the whole book here. When you go chapter a day, it goes actually very, very quickly. So you can understand how this stuff up here, this pattern, this wall tile fragment, he's kind of reverse engineering it conceptually. So you can see how the iteration works. And unlike some of the philosophies of, say, what Zaha Hadid or Libeskind would do, where you iterate kind of as an end in itself, this is not iteration as an end in itself. This is iteration with the goal of vibrancy and of life, and where you iterate and then you let it go. You stop once you realize you've achieved a certain good optimal state for what you need in the design. And if you keep iterating it, you're going to grind this sense of life to dust. So you have to let go at a certain point. In fact, there's one of the properties that's called simplicity and inner calm, which is important. Talks about doorways. We'll skip over that. So here, again, the columns. Now, he's explored this concept of iteration, and now he applies it to the columns in that terrace in the hotel in Ravello, the Palumbo. So you can see that if you start off with a column, and then you chamfer the corners, and then you space them out so that the space between them becomes a harmonious, proportional space within itself, and then you add a base to the column. You put the column on top of kind of a tile work or grid like that, a grid of tiles that are spaced in a way. And so you can see if you start from the top there with a single column, and then you see the column with even these very simple transformations having been applied to it, these iterative transformations, and you can see how even very quickly and very simply you get from something that's like this kind of not very great caisson, and then you enliven it and you turn it into a place that feels wonderful to be. And that's good design. So this is a useful way in which that can happen, that you can really apply to any number of processes and places. And here's another example. This is the Julian Street Inn, and actually not far from Ravello, a bit far south of it, there's the, on this side, that is the Temple of Hera in Old Posidonia, Paestum. Striking, amazing place, Paestum, a little bit south of Salerno in Italy. And the great mystery of entasis, putting the entasis on the correct entasis on the correct syllable, the swelling of the columns, the entasis there, about how he has kind of another theory behind it, that the reason the Greeks chose entasis was because it creates such a lively and vibrant space and shape. That may or may not have been what the Greeks were thinking, but it certainly does work that way. That imagine if those were straight columns or even tapered columns, it wouldn't be as lively of an interplay of positive and negative space. That's the ground plan of the Temple of Hera, which is very, very beautiful and profound, and it's been admired by many, many generations of architects. Even Vitruvius admired that was old. That place was old, considered old and ancient when Vitruvius was alive. That's the oldest. It's kind of interesting. That's the oldest stone Greek temple in the world, and it's in Italy. Fun how that works. That's colonialism. It literally is imperial colonialism. Those are all those Greeks who lived in Italy. And it's also cultural appropriation, those terrible Romans culturally appropriating Greek things. Hiring Greek stonemasons, how dare they? So the... and Jewish and Armenian stonemasons also worked for the Romans. So the breadth of the concept of living structure. Let's go on. So at the end of this, and he points this out, the next chapter is about the 15 fundamental properties. That really starts to get to the heart of the method and some of the really fantastic ways that he talks about how there are certain definite, I don't want to say elements, but certain qualities, certain consistent epiphenomena that are invariant in the sense of life that you always notice as being there when something is vibrant. And you don't make something vibrant by combining these as elements, but what you do is you shape it and you observe if they're there or not, and then change something in a way to amplify one or several of these properties, also called transformations. So he says, and this is very important, drawing all the centers so that all of the centers in a given area have life in them is geometrically and physically hard to do. It is. You can try it. You can just even sketching as a fun experiment. Even after you have recognized how important the centers are, you will find that you cannot easily make all the centers work at the same time. You fix one and another goes off. This is a classic problem of design which, early in his career, he exemplified in Notes on the Synthesis of Form. It's the problem of cybernetics, of the system of interactive parts. This is why order of operations is so important. When you make that one, another becomes distorted. It takes enormous skill and concentration to draw a pattern so that all the centers at once have their full strength. To do it requires a mode of perception unlike the one we are used to, in which every pencil stroke is creating centers, and more than one at a time. So this is... And again, this is something that some of the most famous of the 20th century artists, such as Picasso or Matisse, would practice as a kind of discipline. That they would go into this very simplified, almost reductive drawing in the case of Picasso, in his late sketches, and Matisse with his colored paper cutouts, that they were understanding the harmony of form in a very important way. And they probably were, understanding it in their own way, doing the kind of thing that Chris is talking about right here. So he says, in the rules described in the next chapter control the ways that living centers can be made from other centers. As far as I have been able to determine, there are only 15 of these rules. I would say that there are less than that. Why do I say this? I think some of those rules, we'll see it next time on living process. These rules, the 15 fundamental properties, some of them seem awfully similar to another. There's one, for example, called positive space, and another called good shape. And these are kind of the same thing. There's something underneath it that hasn't quite been fully understood yet. So you can see for yourself when tomorrow we go over that. So I'm trying to keep these to around 15 minutes for everybody. Like, share, and subscribe. Comments below if you'd like to hear what's going on, to ask me questions, to tell me what you'd like to see. So thank you guys so much, and we're going to keep going through. Look at that. That's how far we are. We got that much of the book to go. Moves along kind of quickly. Have a good day.